My name is Violetta. I'm 35 years old, living in Chicago, and I used to be the director of client strategy at a major media corporation where I spent 8 years of my life. That morning at 5 a.m., I was summoned to the company without a word. No stop at my office, no time to pack. Just one cold sentence from the CEO: "You're being terminated for breach of trust." No explanation. No chance to speak. I stood there under the harsh lights of the boardroom, escorted out of the building like a traitor. But what they didn't expect was that I held a secret that could bring down the empire they so desperately wanted to protect. Have you ever been let go from a place you gave your youth to, all because of a vague accusation? Share your thoughts in the comments, hit like and subscribe to the channel if you've ever been treated unfairly, because my story began that morning. And it didn't end there. I started at Stratwell Group before I even knew which hand I preferred using the mouse with. I was 27, fresh out of grad school with a degree in strategic communications, 3 months behind on rent, and juggling 3 part-time jobs. One winter evening, I stumbled across a listing from Stratwell for an unpaid marketing internship. It clearly stated, only one position available, maximum 3 months, no guarantee of employment. I submitted my application that same night, not expecting much. 3 days later, I was invited to interview with Monica Graves, then still Director of Business Development, not yet the CEO. She looked at me through thin-rimmed glasses, her eyes both sharp and kind. "It's unpaid. Are you sure you can handle that?" I remember smiling and saying, "If you give me a chance, I'll make sure you never regret it." And I did. For the first 3 months, I made coffee, took meeting notes, organized files, and ran errands between departments. I never complained, never missed a day. Every night, I came home with frozen hands and aching feet, but I still stayed up reading materials, researching every client the company served. I memorized every pitch deck from the strategy department even though no one asked me to. Once Monica saw me taking notes after a long meeting and just said, "You're dedicated, huh?" By month 4, they offered me a full-time contract as an associate managing lower-tier accounts. To me, it felt like I'd been handed the world. I didn't have an office, just a small desk near the filing cabinets, but I treated every task with full respect. The client's other colleagues called difficult. I asked to take them on. I listened to every complaint, carefully analyzed feedback, and adjusted each campaign detail by detail. Within 1 year, 5 of those small clients had renewed their contracts. 3 of them nearly doubled their budgets. I was promoted to mid-tier accounts. Everything changed when Eversight Technologies, one of our top 3 clients, ran into serious trouble with a product launch. Their previous account manager suddenly quit and the project spiraled into chaos. During an emergency leadership meeting, Monica turned to me. "Are you willing to take this on?" I nodded, unaware that this answer would change the course of my entire career. I spent 12 hours a day for a full week auditing the entire campaign. I called every contact at Eversight personally, apologized, clarified objectives, suggested edits, and rebuilt the timeline from scratch. I rewrote the entire marketing strategy within 3 days and presented it myself to their executive board the following Monday. A week later, not only did Eversight stay with us on their $20 million contract, they expanded it by another $3 million. There's Mr. Glenn Avery sent a personal letter of thanks to Monica, but in the middle of it he wrote, "We appreciate the dedication and creativity of Ms. Violetta, who helped us see the real value in this partnership." From that day on, I was the sole lead on Eversight. Monica sent an internal email praising me, calling me a model for redefining client relationships. She even brought me into her office, placed a hand on my shoulder and said, "I'm proud of you." But that warmth didn't last. Over time, every time a client mentioned me by name at conferences, or a campaign I proposed got selected, Monica grew colder. Compliments I gave to our team were redirected as if I was trying to spotlight myself. The first time I requested a raise was after the Eversight rebranding campaign, which won a statewide award. I brought in data, performance charts, and industry salary benchmarks. Monica smiled, said I made a strong case, then closed with, "This year the company is prioritizing infrastructure upgrades, so we're tight on personnel budgets. But I appreciate your efforts." I nodded. I believed patience was necessary. But the following year, after bringing in 3 new major clients, executing 6 successful campaigns, and securing a marketing deal with a top regional automaker, the answer didn't change: budget constraints. I began to sense something wrong when a newly hired employee, far less experienced than me, was granted a raise just 6 months into his probation. Monica shrugged it off. His position falls under a strategic priority group. I stayed quiet. I believed good work wouldn't go unnoticed. But the third rejection finally numbed me. After helping Eversight renew their contract for another 2 years at a record-breaking value, I submitted a raise proposal, again. Monica barely skimmed it and said, "Your performance is excellent, but this year we're investing in artificial intelligence and automation. We need to tighten up a bit." I walked out of her office in silence. Her words, once familiar, now sounded hollow. As I passed her down the hallway, I overheard her on the phone laughing. "I know it's signed already. No, not enough to give out bonuses yet. Someone else is shouldering the heavy load anyway." I paused. I didn't have to ask who she meant. What I didn't know then was that this was just the beginning. After the third raise denial, I started waking up each morning with the feeling that I was walking into a place that no longer belonged to me. I still performed, still cared for every client like always, but inside something had shifted. The drive was gone. I stopped believing my efforts would ever be rewarded. One Friday evening, while sitting at my usual cafe in River North, I received a message from Eli Turner, a college friend and now a deputy strategy director at Brightcore, a fast-growing media firm. He wrote, "We're opening a new role I think matches your background. You should consider it." I didn't respond right away. But after a few hours of thinking, I sent an email from my personal account. "Eli, thanks for thinking of me. Send me some more info, please. I'm not quite ready to leave Stratwell, but I can't deny that I'm feeling stuck." That was all I wrote. No resume. No promises. Just a private conversation between two friends. 3 days later, as I was leaving the office, Lauren, my team colleague, called me. "Violetta, can you stop by IT real quick? There's something weird with your personal email account." I turned back. In the IT room, Dean, the department head, looked uneasy. "There's been a strange access attempt to your Gmail from inside our network. You might want to check your security." I stood silent. That account had only ever been logged in once from my personal laptop. Never through any company system. "When did you notice it?" I asked. Dean avoided my gaze. "The request came from upper management. I'm not allowed to say more." I left the IT room with a knot in my chest. A few hours later, I got a call requesting my presence at the corporate office early the next morning, urgent and strictly punctual. I arrived at 5:45 a.m. Monica was already there, seated at the long conference table. Beside her sat the head of HR and a security guard. On the table was a printed email I recognized immediately, the message I'd sent to Eli. Monica didn't let me speak. "Do you know why you're here this morning?" I looked her straight in the eye. "I'm not sure." She slid the paper toward me. "This is proof that you're job hunting while collecting a paycheck and managing our most critical client. You hid this from leadership, used company time for personal gain. As CEO, I cannot keep someone like that in this organization." "That was a personal email," I replied, my voice steadier than I expected. "I didn't send a resume, didn't ask for a leave, didn't deceive anyone. I simply asked for information from a friend." Monica raised an eyebrow. "You don't see that as betrayal? You were given authority, trusted to manage a multi-million-dollar relationship, and yet you quietly looked for a way out. To me, that's a serious breach of trust." I froze. In that moment, I felt both angry and humiliated. "I've worked here for 8 years, I said. I submitted 3 formal salary adjustment proposals. I never took a personal day off. I handled every client crisis, including stepping in for you when Eversight threatened to pull out. If you're asking who betrayed whom, I'm not the one who needs to answer first." No one responded. The head of HR flipped through my file. "We've revoked your system access. Security will escort you to collect your personal belongings." Monica stood, her voice cold as steel. "This decision is effective immediately." I didn't cry. I didn't ask for an explanation. But what struck me the most was the look in Monica's eyes as I left the room. Not a trace of regret. This was someone who once called me her right hand. Now she looked at me like a threat that had finally been neutralized. I walked down the long hallway on the 19th floor. The coworkers I had once supported, shared lunches with, lowered their eyes to avoid mine. Only Jessica, the young receptionist, rushed to hold the elevator for me. I don't know what to say, she whispered. You didn't deserve this. I gave her a faint smile and nodded in thanks. My office had already been locked. A security officer used a spare key to let me in. In under 5 minutes, I packed everything into a cardboard box. Some books, 2 framed photos of my mother and me, and the little orchid Jessica had given me for my birthday last year. As I walked through the main lobby, I didn't look back. But inside me, something had shifted forever. Not because I'd been fired, but because I now knew. Someone in the company had secretly read my personal message, printed it out, and used it to eliminate me. No investigation, no HR review. Just one signature from Monica. And that wasn't going to be the end of it. I left the Stratwell building just as the clock struck 7 a.m. The city was still drowsy in the early morning mist, and no one on the sidewalk could have guessed that the woman carrying that cardboard box had just lost 8 years of her life. I didn't cry. Not because I was strong, but because I felt empty. My emotions had been drained by the shock and the quiet, slow burn of betrayal. I drove home in silence. No radio, no phone calls. When I got home, I set the box on the kitchen counter and stood there, staring at it like it was something foreign. No one ever teaches you how to process being discarded. No thank you. No proper goodbye. Just as I sat down, my phone rang. It was the hospital. A nurse spoke urgently. Clara, your mother, was brought in earlier this morning. Looks like a minor stroke. Can you come? Minor stroke sounds harmless. But I knew for my 72-year-old mother, it could be a turning point. She lived alone in the suburbs of Skokie. I grabbed my keys and rushed to the hospital. By the time I arrived, she was stable. The doctor said the episode was mild, but she'd need to be monitored for a few days. I sat by her bedside, looking at her fragile face, feeling a lump rise in my throat. She had always believed in me, even during times when I couldn't believe in myself. But I didn't tell her what had happened that morning. I just said, I'm taking a few days off to take care of you. She nodded gently. During those 2 days in the hospital, I turned off all my phone notifications. But on the 3rd night, while washing a mug in my mom's tiny apartment, I turned my phone back on and saw a message from Jacob Lanning, a former colleague from the strategy team who had since moved to another company. I heard what happened. I'm really sorry. But you should know. Last month when I visited the office, I overheard Monica telling the CFO, she's too good. Too dangerous if we can't control her. I didn't get it then. Now I do. I read that line over and over. Too dangerous. I'd always thought of myself as dedicated, hard-working, competent. I never played politics. Never tried to be a threat. But to Monica, that dedication had become something to fear, because I was no longer easy to manage. And I began to understand why Lauren, someone I once called my closest friend at work, had said nothing the day I was fired. We had pulled late nights building campaign strategies together, once split a sandwich at midnight on deadline, and she was the first person to know I loved jazz. She was also the one who drove me to urgent care when I collapsed at the office from exhaustion. And yet, that morning she stood just a few steps away, unable to meet my eyes. I had tried to tell myself she was scared, or in shock. But a few days later, I saw her LinkedIn post, honored to be appointed as Associate Director of Client Strategy at Stratwell Group. Grateful for the leadership's trust. I didn't feel angry, just hollow. I sat alone in the living room, a cold cup of tea in hand. Memories piled up like torn reels of film. I thought about the time I defended Lauren when a client tore apart her proposal. I thought about the night I stayed up until 2 a.m. helping her fix a broken budget forecast. I had believed there were no lines between colleagues and friends. But maybe, in a world where power meant everything, loyalty had become just another currency to bargain with. I didn't resent her for choosing her path. But I had to accept a bitter truth. I had mistaken goodwill for loyalty. Maybe I'd been loyal to people who no longer deserved it. I opened my personal email. There were a few connection requests from people I'd collaborated with on outside projects. One was from Eli, my friend at Brightcore. I don't know what happened, but if you're open to it, we should talk. We still need someone like you. I hadn't replied yet. I needed time. But inside me, something was shifting. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't revenge. It was the quiet, resolute understanding that if I didn't protect myself, no one else would. I looked over at my mother sleeping soundly, her breathing soft and steady. I pulled the blanket up gently, then walked over to her dining table and opened my laptop. The screen lit up, casting a faint glow on my face, tired but calm. I started typing. Not a complaint. Not a resume. But a letter, one word at a time, addressed to someone I'd tried to forget. Someone who once told me, "If you ever notice something unusual, call me." Richard Lawton, board member of Stratwell Group. Some truths aren't meant to stay buried. And I had kept this one quiet for far too long. I began sorting through old documents in my former work folder one rainy morning. My mother had been discharged from the hospital, her condition stable, and I needed a reason to put things in order, inside and out. Reports, meeting notes, old contracts. I categorized everything, planning to print the important ones for record keeping. At the very back of the lowest drawer, I found an old manila envelope with no sender's name. I opened it. Inside was a printed letter, one I had typed and sent internally nearly 6 months earlier. I had hesitated a long time before hitting send. That letter had been written after a quarterly budget meeting, where I happened to see a financial statement Monica presented that didn't match our strategy department's data. The discrepancy wasn't massive, but enough to raise red flags. I wasn't the type to meddle. But the more I looked, the more I found repeated entries labeled high-tier client entertainment for events that never happened. I had also once seen Monica using a company vehicle for personal trips, something no one dared mention. When I wrote that letter, I had thought it through carefully. I didn't make accusations, only pointed out suspicious inconsistencies and urged the board to audit the internal reporting system. I sent the letter anonymously because I knew if my name was revealed, the consequences would come faster than any chance to explain. But I never received any response. Not a single acknowledgement. Not one concrete action. I had forgotten about the letter entirely until that morning. I sat in silence, holding the thin piece of paper, feeling the weight in my chest. Something in me ached, but something else felt unexpectedly clear. I had been pushed out of the company in the coldest way. And now what I had once tried to warn them about was in my hands. Undeniable proof of the silence of an organization I had trusted. I picked up my phone, opened my contacts, and searched for a name: Richard Lawton. He was the first person who interviewed me 5 years ago when I was promoted to the Eversight account. A man in his 60s, quiet, someone who observed more than he spoke. But after that strategy presentation, he had put a hand on my shoulder as I left the boardroom and said, "You have vision. Don't let the system limit you." I thought he was just being polite. But now he was the only person I felt I could trust. I opened my laptop again and started a new email. "Dear Mr. Lawton, my name is Violetta Morgan, former Director of Client Strategy at Stratwell Group. I'm writing this letter under my real name, not anonymously as I did 6 months ago. I'm resending the letter I once submitted to the board, raising concerns about manipulated financial data I discovered while working with the strategy team. Back then I received no reply. But now, after being terminated without just cause based on a personal email accessed without permission, I believe it's time someone took another look. I'm not writing out of revenge, but to make it clear that my warnings were not baseless assumptions. Sincerely, Violetta Morgan." I attached the original letter, along with a few photos I had quietly taken of unreleased internal spending sheets. I read the message twice. Every sentence was measured. No accusations, only facts. I hit send. The screen showed, "Message sent." I leaned back in my chair, feeling both relieved and anxious. No one knew what would happen next. Maybe my letter would be ignored again. Or maybe this time someone would actually listen. That evening, while making dinner, my phone rang. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number. I answered. "Miss Morgan." "Yes, this is she. This is Richard Lawton. I received your letter." His voice was calm and steady. I held my breath. "That letter," he paused. "I remember seeing it. But I didn't know who sent it. We're instructed to keep all anonymous reports confidential. But to be honest, I flagged it for further review after this year's audit." "I understand," I said softly. "Would you be willing to meet in person? There are some things I'd like to ask you. If what you discovered is accurate, then we need to act. And quickly." I hesitated for a few seconds. "Yes, I'm willing." I hung up. And for the first time in days of gray skies, I stood in my mother's kitchen holding a soup ladle, feeling something stir within me. Not vindication, but the quiet reclaiming of a voice I had once lost. The next morning, I received an email from the HR department at Brightcore. They invited me to a final interview for the position of Director of Strategy Development, a senior-level role, even higher than what I'd held at Stratwell. I sat in front of the screen for a few moments. This was the kind of opportunity one had once dreamed of. A company on the rise, a strong budget, a modern work culture, and a role that would let me build my own team from the ground up. But the name in the invitation gave me pause. Ellen Cross, Senior Executive Officer, would be conducting the interview, and she'd be my direct manager if I accepted the job. Ellen had been my former supervisor 4 years ago when she served as a strategic advisor on a joint project between two firms. We had clashed more than once over campaign direction. She was tough, strictly by the book, not easily moved. And I, once I had data in hand, wasn't easily swayed by theory alone. After that project we didn't speak again. But I remembered the look she gave me on the final day, half disappointed, half wary. I had thought I'd never work under her again. I arrived at Brightcore headquarters right on time. The building was new, with shining glass panels and open spaces filled with natural light. A receptionist greeted me and led me to the 13th floor. Ellen was already seated in the large glass conference room, with a wall of windows overlooking Lake Michigan sparkling in the sun. She wore a black suit, crisp white shirt, hair neatly pinned up, her sharp gaze unchanged since the last time I saw her. "I assume you know why we needed a face-to-face," Ellen began as I sat down, her tone composed but direct. "I assume it's because our past was never particularly smooth," I answered honestly. She nodded. "You've always been straightforward. That's a good thing." She slid a thin folder across the table. "I reviewed your application. Impressive. Your performance at Stratwell was strong. But I also received a warning letter. From Monica Graves." I wasn't surprised, but my heart still thudded. "May I ask, do you believe what was written?" Ellen gave a small, wry smile and leaned back slightly. "Actually, no. Because you're not the only one Monica's tried to smear." I tilted my head slightly. She did the same to me 3 years ago when I was being considered for an executive role at a competitor. Monica claimed I wasn't suited for leadership because I was too assertive. Just like she labeled you dangerous. I haven't forgotten that. I clenched my hands slightly on my lap. "Then why did you still want to meet with me?" Ellen looked directly into my eyes. "Because I don't judge people by someone else's version of the story. I need to understand why you are the right person for Brightcore, even if our past wasn't perfect." I nodded. "I've worked under your leadership before. I know I'm not always right, but I've never lacked integrity. If there's one thing I've learned in these 8 years, it's this: being competent isn't enough. You have to know how to stand tall, even when no one's standing with you." "You think you've learned how to do that?" Ellen asked. "I think I'm learning how to do it better. I used to be loyal to the point of letting others define my worth. But now I won't allow that to happen again." She looked at me for a long moment as if trying to decide whether my answer was just a defense mechanism or something deeper. Finally, she tilted her head slightly and said in a measured tone, "If you join us, you'll face quiet battles. Things that won't show up in emails or meeting notes. There will be times when people set traps for you, not because you're wrong but because you're doing better than they are. Are you ready for an environment like that?" I didn't hesitate. "I'm not here to be liked. I'm here to deliver results." Ellen leaned forward and closed the folder. "I like that answer." She stood up and extended her hand. "Welcome to Brightcore, Violetta." I shook her hand. Shaking hands with someone I had once fiercely disagreed with was a strange experience. But I wasn't afraid. I wasn't hesitant. I felt more clear than ever that I was stepping into a new chapter, not to prove my value to anyone but to build it for myself. 1 week after my interview at Brightcore, just as I was leaving an internal meeting, my phone rang. The caller was Elaine Rutherford, Senior Administrative Assistant to the Stratwell Board. "Morgan, the board would like to invite you to a private meeting this Wednesday morning. We hope you can make time." Her voice was polite and composed, but there was a note of hesitation at the end. I knew something had happened. On Wednesday, I arrived on time at the executive suite on the top floor of Stratwell's building, a place I had never once set foot in during my 8 years there. The receptionist led me down a long hallway with deep blue carpet, through 2 layers of frosted glass doors, and into a fully soundproof conference room. There were 7 people in the room. Familiar faces from shareholder meetings, people I had only ever seen on internal reports or heard mentioned in executive briefings. At the head of the table sat Richard Lawton, the one who had called me the previous week. He gave me a slight smile as I entered. "Morgan, thank you for coming," he said, gesturing to the seat across from him. Beside him was Samantha Young, the board chair, stern-faced with her hands tightly folded. I could see thick folders in front of each board member. I knew they had reviewed my letter and everything I'd included with the email. "We've reviewed what you sent," Samantha said, her voice low but firm. "And we have a few questions before any formal action is taken." I nodded. "I'm ready to answer." "Do you have proof that Ms. Monica Graves ordered the IT department to access your personal email account?" "I don't have a formal directive," I replied. "But I do have a copy of an internal email from Monica to Dean Howard, the head of IT, asking him to monitor any unusual digital activity from Violetta Morgan, including but not limited to access attempts outside the system." I handed over a printed copy of the email that Jacob had forwarded to me after he left the company. The sender's name, timestamp, and subject line were all clearly visible. The room went silent for a few seconds. Richard flipped through his copy of the documents. "Do you understand that under HR policy, this constitutes a serious violation of personal privacy?" "I do," I answered. But at that time, I had no one I could trust and no position strong enough to speak up. Samantha leaned forward. "Besides the email issue, you also submitted a summary of questionable expenses in the internal budget reports. Can you elaborate on the data source?" "I personally managed the budget for the Eversight campaign. While reviewing, I found duplicated client entertainment expenses. Same day, different locations, identical descriptions but different totals. I cross-checked with the finance team and discovered the transaction history had been altered in the expense system." I placed another small folder on the table. "I backed up this data on an external hard drive because I was afraid it might be edited or deleted after I submitted the initial report." Another board member, Bryce Hammond, director of risk, looked at me through thick glasses. "How long have you held on to this data?" "About 6 months. I submitted an anonymous report at the time, but received no response." Richard nodded. "I acknowledge receiving that letter. And I take responsibility for not pursuing it more aggressively then." No one spoke for a few beats. Then suddenly, Tobias Kent, a long-serving board member seated at the end of the table, let out a dry laugh. So the only person with any integrity in that room was the first to get fired. No one responded, but a few of the board members looked visibly uncomfortable. Samantha straightened her posture. "Morgan, we appreciate your courage in coming forward. What you've shared will serve as the foundation for our internal decision meeting this afternoon. Monica Graves has been placed on temporary suspension during the review process." I just nodded. I wasn't there to reclaim my honor or to demand an apology. I just wanted them to see the truth, the same truth I had once tried to deliver in silence. As I turned to leave the room, Richard called out to me. "Morgan, whatever happens next, I want you to know. You did the right thing. And we owe you more than we can say." I looked at him, saw the sincerity in his eyes. "I don't need anyone to owe me, Mr. Lawton," I said quietly. "I just need them to stop pretending they never saw it." Then I walked out, feeling lighter, as if I had just set down a boulder I'd carried far too long. Not because I'd won, but because, finally, someone had listened. 3 days after that closed-door meeting, Stratwell's internal communications released a brief announcement. Monica Graves had officially stepped down from her role as Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately. No farewell ceremony. No celebratory send-off. Below that statement was a cascade of actions launched within a single week. Financial reports from the last 3 years were being reviewed. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in client entertainment expenses were traced, some of them tied to restaurant bills from places no employees had ever heard of, and consulting fees paid to a shell company owned by Monica's cousin. Several senior staff under her leadership, the same people who once shook my hand without meeting my eyes, were now being summoned one by one. 1 week later, I received an unexpected call from Elaine Rutherford, the board's administrative assistant. Miss Morgan, she said in a soft, measured tone, the board has unanimously decided to offer you a return to Stratwell. With a salary double your previous compensation and the title of Vice President of Strategic Development. I wasn't surprised. I had anticipated this moment from the minute I walked out of that boardroom. What I hadn't expected was the stillness inside me. No joy. No satisfaction. Just a long, quiet pause. May I ask why they want me back? I asked. Because they believe you're the only one who truly understands the system, she replied. Someone who's operated within it without being compromised. They need someone free of internal bias to help rebuild the leadership structure. I paused. Thank you for your honesty. But I have to decline. I heard the pause on the other end of the line. Are you sure? I believe this is a real opportunity for you to reshape things the right way. Miss Rutherford, I replied, my voice low and steady. I'm not going back to a place that only recognizes someone's value after they've lost them. I ended the call gently. No hesitation. No second thoughts. That night, I received a message from Lauren. It had been a long time since she last reached out. Her message was brief. Heard about Monica. I know now you were telling the truth. I'm sorry I didn't stand by you. But I was just scared. I stared at the message for a while, then set my phone down. I wasn't angry. But I didn't have anything to say back either. I remembered the last afternoon Monica and I sat at the same table. That day I said to her with all the patience I had left, some people manage through authority. Others lead through trust. I used to believe you were the second kind. Monica didn't respond. At the time I thought she just didn't want to argue. Now I understand, maybe she had nothing left to defend. The next morning I arrived at Brightcore as usual. No one on my team knew what had happened at Stratwell and I didn't tell them. I didn't want the scars of the past to shape how I began here. As I passed by the internal comms area, I overheard a few people mentioning a headline from a business magazine, the free fall of a once golden CEO in the advertising world. I didn't stop. Instead, I walked into the meeting room to begin orientation with the new strategy team. They were eager, open, full of the energy I once had 8 years ago when I first started at Stratwell. Looking at their young faces, I told myself, if I do this right, I'll help create a workplace where people don't have to fear being too good, where no one has to lower their eyes or dim their light in front of their boss. I didn't come to Brightcore to get revenge. I came to do what no one had done at Stratwell. Not to fix the past, but to build something from the ground up in a way no one could twist or take away again. And that was the first truly free decision I made for myself. 6 months later, I stood in the top-floor glass conference room at Brightcore headquarters, looking down at the flow of people below, and felt almost unfamiliar with the version of me I had become. Not because I hadn't imagined someday being in a higher position with a stronger voice, but because in those past visions I always saw myself bracing, defending, proving. Here I was being heard without having to shout. Given opportunities without having to beg. I'd stepped into the role of Director of Strategic Development in February. 3 months later, Alan Cross nominated me to be the face of Brightcore's Global Expansion Launch event, a role usually reserved for executive board members or founders. I was surprised when she brought it up during a strategy session. You have a story every market needs to hear, Alan said, her eyes unwavering. You don't just represent capability, you represent resilience. We want our partners to know Brightcore doesn't just choose the best people. We choose the real ones. I didn't know how to respond, so I simply nodded. Ellen kept her word. She didn't interfere in my professional decisions but always had my back through internal political conflicts. Once, when a board member challenged my strategic overhaul proposal, Ellen calmly said during the meeting, "If you want to change the strategy, fine. But be prepared to explain to our investors why we just handed our industry lead to the competition because we were too afraid to innovate." After the meeting, she stopped by my office and left me with one simple sentence: "Keep going. I've got your back." I wasn't used to being defended. But this time I learned not to reject it. In June, I was invited to speak at the annual conference of the American Strategic Communications Association. It was a major event, bringing together nearly 400 representatives from media, tech, and investment firms across the country. That morning, I wore a pearl-colored suit, simple but elegant. Not to impress, but to remind myself I was no longer the person waiting outside a boardroom for a chance to be invited in. As I signed in at the speaker table, a voice behind me called out softly but clearly, "Violetta?" I turned around. It was Lauren. She looked thinner than the last time I saw her, her hair neatly tied back, faint circles under her eyes. In her hand was a portfolio folder. "You attending the conference too?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. She nodded with a hesitant smile. "I applied to 2 companies with booths here. I'm no longer at Stratwell. After Monica left, our whole team was disbanded." I nodded silently. Not because I didn't want to speak, but because I didn't know what I had the right to say. Lauren looked down at the floor for a moment, then back up. "I could have done something back then. But I didn't. I was scared. I know I owe you an apology." I looked at her. 100 responses ran through my head, but in the end I simply said, "You don't owe me anything." But if there's one thing I've learned from that experience, it's that staying silent in the face of wrong doesn't just betray others. It betrays yourself. Lauren didn't argue. She nodded and let out a quiet sigh. "Good luck on your speech. I heard you're the keynote." I smiled. "Thank you. Good luck to you too." We parted ways there. No hug, no rekindling of the past. But I wasn't sad. As I understood, some people don't walk the next part of the journey with you, but they'll always be a part of where you came from. When I stepped onto the main stage under the opening music, the spotlight made it hard to see the faces in the crowd. But I didn't need to see anyone to know I was exactly where I needed to be. I took the microphone and drew a deep breath. And when I spoke, I didn't just talk about market expansion strategies or Brightcore's recent successes. I spoke about the days I was pushed to the margins, about the moments I felt like I had lost my voice, and about how one woman with no power, no title, could still rise from where others thought she had fallen. The speech didn't have fancy quotes, but I knew every word I said was true. And for me, that was enough. 1 year after I left Stratwell, I stood on the main stage at the Midwest Leadership Conference, holding a crystal award engraved with the words, "Most Inspiring Leader of the Year." The entire auditorium of nearly 500 people sat in silence as the host read my name and invited me to the stage. I stepped through the spotlight and in my mind echoed the faces, the moments, the times I almost gave up but chose to keep going. Ellen Cross sat in the front row, her eyes full of pride. My strategy team from Brightcore clapped enthusiastically. But the image that moved me most was one that flashed through my memory. My mother holding my hand tightly during her hospital discharge last year, saying, "If they don't see you, show them with your own light." I stood at the microphone looking out at the sea of people waiting. I didn't need a prepared speech. I knew exactly what I would say. "I used to think success meant recognition," I began, my voice clear and calm. "That it meant someone calling your name on stage or handing you an award. But I've come to realize some values must start from within, not wait for someone else's validation." A soft stillness filled the room. I was once fired for daring to look for another path, after 8 years of loyalty without a single complaint. I once stayed quiet to avoid being labeled difficult, to hold on to a position I probably should have outgrown long ago. And I once thought I was wrong, simply because they didn't choose to keep me. I paused, letting the words settle in the air. But I'm standing here today to tell you this. Respect doesn't come from the outside. It has to begin with you. You might be excluded from a company, a position, a meeting. But no one can take away the trust you have in yourself. The first round of applause came from the far right corner. Then it spread across the room. I bowed my head, not out of gratitude, but as a quiet closing to a chapter now behind me. After the award ceremony, I returned to the Brightcore office late in the afternoon. The receptionist congratulated me as I walked in. A bouquet of white flowers waited on my desk with a handwritten note. "Thank you for proving that kindness can still exist in power." No signature. But I knew it was from Ellen. I walked straight into my office. On my desk was a new folder, neatly placed beside a signed document. The long-term strategic partnership agreement between Brightcore and Eversight Technologies. I sat down and quietly looked at the contract. A year ago, Eversight had still been my client at Stratwell. They were the reason I stayed so long at that old company, because I believed in what we had built together. But after Monica's investigation, the contract was never renewed. I had assumed Eversight would seek a new agency or develop an in-house team. I didn't expect that last month they'd reach out to me directly. The first meeting took place in a small conference room at Brightcore. Glenn Avery, their chairman, looked at me with his familiar, composed expression. "You know," he said, "I've been following your journey from afar. When Monica claimed you were no longer trustworthy, I didn't believe it. And time proved I was right." "Thank you," I replied. "I've kept all the data and working habits from our time together. If we start again, there won't be any gaps." "We're not starting again," he said. "We're continuing from where we should have never stopped." The contract was signed that same afternoon. And now it sat on my desk, catching the late sun through the window pane. I stood and walked to the window, watching the city slowly shift colors in the golden hour. Down below, people moved hurriedly, cars flowed in rhythm. I placed my hand on the cool glass, feeling at peace. Not because I had settled a score, but because I no longer saw it as a debt. Sometimes revenge isn't about striking back. It's about moving forward, on your own feet. Upright, steady, and not looking back to curse the past, but only to acknowledge you've outgrown it. I don't know if my story speaks to you, but if it does, I hope you'll pause for a moment and ask yourself, have you ever been overlooked in a place where you should have been valued? Have you ever been excluded from a room, an opportunity, simply because someone feared you were too skilled, too honest? If you've felt that way, I want to hear from you. Share your story, whether it happened at work, within your family, or in your closest relationships. Because sometimes just knowing you're not the only one who's been cast aside is enough to give someone else the strength to keep going. I've always believed the most meaningful things don't live in contracts, titles, or status. They live in how we rise, in how we choose not to become bitter, even after being hurt. If this journey resonates with you, follow this channel to hear more real, heartfelt stories that shine light on the hidden corners of work, family, and those quiet moments we rarely speak about.